PanWorks, bringing ethics to life. Welcome to Pan Thinks, the podcast of PanWorks, an ethics think tank dedicated to animal well-being. I'm Bill Lynn, your host for the pod. Tonight we're discussing animal well-being with Liv Baker. Liv is a professor of biology at Sarah Lawrence College and a fellow at PanWorks. She is also a pioneer in the field of animal well-being. Her ideas about well-being incorporate yet transcend older models of animal welfare and help us envision how we can do right by other animals. Liv, it's a delight to have you with us tonight. Take it away.
Great. Thanks, Bill. And thanks everybody for being here and joining with us in the conversation that we're about to have. And so, yeah, while I am going to be speaking for a bit, I do want this to be a conversation. So, yeah, please just keep track of any questions. And there might be a place or two where during the talk that I actually ask you to turn your microphones on if I think of it. So just be prepared for that if that happens, because I might have a question or two for you all. So yeah, thanks again. So I'm here to talk about well-being in animal lives. And so this is part of the Pan Thinks, which is a PanWorks webinar. So I'm really, grateful to be here with you all. So in order for me to sort of get into talking about well-being and even animal welfare, I need to talk about sort of my journey a bit, because it is a personal journey and a professional journey. And my thinking and my conceptualization have evolved a lot. And evolution is ongoing. And that's also part of what I want us to talk about is that evolution, that this is a dynamic thing. This isn't, nothing is set in stone, nor should it be, if we are to progress our thinking and continue to improve things for other animals. So I just wanted to talk about three wonderful animals that I've had the privilege of working with that have really transformed me in many ways. So I want to just point out these jumping spiders, which are, I call them the cute and furry of the arachnid world. And I don't think I really need to explain why I call them the cute and furry of the arachnid world. I think the photo speaks for itself. But jumping spiders, I worked with for my master's degree. And for that research, I was really interested in wedding animal behavior and conservation, which at the time wasn't really being done. And so I wanted to see if I could study the movement behavior of these jumping spiders to see how the movement behavior was affected by fragmented habitat. And I was still sort of in the mindset of how science sort of performs it, in the sense of we look for generalities, right? We look for commonalities across individuals and across populations and across groups. And so I designed my studies, with that in mind. But as I was conducting the behavioral research, I could see the jumping spiders were behaving very differently from one another. There was clear individual variation. And even though I didn't study personality at the time, there was clear personality traits among those jumping spiders. And that put in my head, a real question of how we conduct science, how we conduct ethological research. And was I really missing something important by looking for these generalities and planing over the really important individual variation? So I kind of put that in the back of my mind as I move forward, but it really shaped what I did for my PhD research. And I worked with another jumping animal, the Stevens kangaroo rat. And so for my PhD work, I just jumped right into personality and individual variation. I wanted to understand who animals are at their very core shaped right? How they dealt with, how they coped with our conservation interventions. And so I was doing translocation work with this species and these individuals. And unsurprisingly, I was able to discern a really rich personality variation, really rich personality dimensions on the species level. But what also happened as part of this work with translocation was the level of complicity that I felt. That seeing these animals as individuals, seeing them with individual variation, with personality in such a way that I could see how our interventions were interfering with their lives. And despite being well-intentioned, we were actually doing potentially real damage to the lives of these kangaroo rats. Perhaps not in the long term if they survive, but certainly in the shorter term, they were affected by what we were doing. So that all of that, thinking about individual variation, thinking about how we mess with the lives of animals, even when we're thinking we're doing something on their behalf, affected the kind of research I move into. And so my work with Asian elephants in Thailand is completely shaped by this journey that I've been on. And with the Asian elephants, my role there is to remove as much complicity as possible and interfere as little as I can, and not intervene really in the type of research I do. And so instead, the goal is to study these animals, work with these elephants in such a way that they are not even indirectly manipulated by my presence in their home, in their forest home. And working with them and working with the community, the human community that they live with, it has really shaped my thinking around animal well-being. So I'll come back to the elephants in a bit, but I just wanted to sort of share a little bit of that with you all, so you understood somewhat where I'm coming from. So in order, though, for us to talk about well-being, right, and how well-being is an evolution in our thinking and our consideration of other animals, it does mean we have to consider welfare and look back at welfare and talk about it. So we are kind of all on the same page. So I am going to talk a little bit about welfare so we feel comfortable with where we're headed, and we're also feel good about the conversation I'm hoping that we're going to have after. So some of you might be, very familiar with this, some maybe not so much, but, please bear with me if you are overly familiar. So animal welfare, and I'm eventually going to talk about animal welfare science, it sort of came from the animal protection movement. And the modern animal protection movement arose around the 19th century. Now, it doesn't mean there weren't animal protection laws in existence as early as the first millennium. However, but when we're talking about the modern protection movement, we're talking about the 19th century. And this movement sort of arose out of concerns, really deep concerns over the quality of life of domesticated and other captive animals. So a lot of the animal species that we're focused on were dogs, cats, farmed animals. Horses were actually a really big species that led to the protection movement in many countries. And the protection movement really focused on the reduction of pain and suffering for those animals under our direct care and management. This also at this time was giving rise to prevention of cruelty societies, anti-cruelty laws, and so forth. the animal welfare science as a discipline is sort of a direct descendant of the animal protection movement. Animal welfare science emerged as a discipline in the 1960s. And as David Fraser, who is a preeminent animal welfare scientist, and full disclosure, my PhD advisor, he writes, animal welfare science occurred as the response to ethical concerns about the treatment of animals and debate about the kind of life they should be allowed to live, right? And there's the language in that, right, is really important, right? In this idea that we as humans are permitting, right, the lives that these other animals get a chance to live or don't get a chance to live. And we'll come back to that. Also, in line with the animal protection movement, animal welfare science also focused its efforts on mitigating negative states like fear, like stress, and so forth, and also mitigating those negative conditions, not just the negative states, but the conditions that might give rise to those negative affective states. And similarly to the protection movement, animal welfare science has historically, and largely does to this day, focus on companion farmed research and entertainment animals, or animals in those spaces. And only really in the last decade and a half have we started to see a turn towards the inclusion of wild animals, particularly free-living wild animals. But for much of its existence, free-living wild animals were outside of the remit of animal welfare science. So interestingly, so here's an image of Animal Machines by Ruth Harrison. So this was a book published in 1964 and is really credited with the rise of animal welfare science at this time, right? Similar to Rachel Carson's publication of Silent Spring and how that shaped the modern conservation movement. Animal Machines, right, is credited for shaping the animal welfare science field. But I want to read a couple of quotations from Ruth Harrison, because we'll start to see this separation, if it was ever coupled, but certainly a divergence happening between the sentiment of Ruth Harrison at the time and actually how animal welfare science proceeded. So I'm just going to open a book I have with some quotations from Ruth. Just bear with me. So Ruth Harrison writes, unmothered, fed artificially, warmed artificially, protected from sunlight, stuffed with antibiotics and sedatives, the units in these factories have no contact with the nature of which they are part. So Ruth Harrison in Animal Machines was focused on the farming industry and what was happening to animals in that world. Another quotation from her is, how far have we the right to take our domination of the animal world? Have we the right to rob them of all pleasure in life simply to make more money more quickly out of their carcasses? Have we the right to treat living creatures solely as food converting machines? And, so by those quotations, we might sort of jump to, maybe not incorrectly, but jump to maybe situating Ruth Harrison more in the animal rights sector than in the animal welfare sector. And certainly by those quotations, they seem discordant with how animal welfare science proceeded, right? Because by those quotations, so again, even though Ruth Harrison is credited with really shaping the animal welfare science movement or field. The fact that animal welfare science, and I'll get more into this, has really focused on mitigation rather than abolition of practices. And I think, so Ruth Harrison, so I guess what I'm getting at is there was radical thought at the time, but pretty soon, right out of the gate, animal welfare science became much less radical than the sentiment that was actually helping to shape it. So this is from the Wikipedia page that I looked at on December 4th about under animal welfare. And I've looked at the animal welfare entry now and again over the years, and it's changed. So I hadn't looked at it in probably, at least a year or so. But interestingly, there's some language that wasn't there. Well-being certainly wasn't there a few years ago. And it's used now, but it's used now in a fairly undefined, vague way. So let me just read this with you. Animal welfare is the well-being of non-human animals. What does that even mean, first of all? Formal standards of animal welfare vary between contexts, but are debated mostly by animal welfare groups, legislators, and academics. Animal welfare science uses measures such as longevity, disease, immunosuppression, behavior, physiology, and reproduction, although there is debate about which of these best indicates animal welfare. And so I pulled this from the Wikipedia site, one, to just sort of spotlight how the language has shifted, but how it's still vague, and juxtaposing that first sentence with animal welfare is the well-being of non-human animals with how we measure it and how quickly we go. And these sentences are in succession on the entry, but how quickly we go towards reducing animals to these measures and compartmentalizing their lives. And so, that's one of the things that in my approach to well-being, we hope to overcome, right? Rather than reducing animals and reducing their lives, but actually seeing them for who they are in their full complexity. So this is from there's a textbook called Animal Welfare, and it's written by and edited by animal welfare scientists, and all of the contributing authors would fall under that category. So this is in the chapter Understanding Animal Welfare. So I just want to read a couple of lines. The term animal welfare is used widely and often loosely in the media and by society in general, often in the context of discussion on politics, economics, trade, food production, and generally what society ought to do to protect animals. In scientific use, the term animal welfare refers to the actual state of an animal rather than to the ethical obligations to care for animals that people have. So while I don't disagree with these statements, animal welfare, like a lot of terms and a lot of concepts, right, are loosely used, variously used in society. And even when they're defined, there might be many definitions depending upon who's doing the defining. So that's understandable, and that's all well and good. But when we talk about the scientific use, right, in that statement, what we're starting to see is an immediate separation between the science and the ethics or the values that are driving the science or the scientific pursuits. And that's, something to really pause on, because, right, if we think about animal protection movement, the rise of animal welfare science, it arose because of ethical concerns, right? It is absolutely, right, a value-driven science, and a science driven by these concerns for the lives of other animals. And yet what we start to see in animal welfare science is this decoupling between the scientific pursuit and the ethics themselves, right? And so when we think about Ruth Harrison, right, and those quotations that I read to you, steeped in those sentiments are the ethics, right? The concern for the lives of those animals. And then when the science, the research starts to happen, right, the sterilization starts to happen. And this also ends up giving a pass to the scientists themselves, the researchers themselves, to say, I'm just here matter-of-factly looking for or trying to discern a welfare state. And maybe I don't need to weigh in on whether this practice should continue, should not continue, should continue in this way or not. I'm just providing that information. And to me, that's really, and I'm not saying these particular authors have this stance, but generally speaking, when we see this type of language used, we start to see this sort of shedding of responsibility, right? And this denial, this implicit denial of the complicity that we have when we don't acknowledge the entanglement of the ethics, the ethical considerations, and the way in which we conduct research and why we're conducting the research. So getting at how do we define welfare, right? So like I said, like many concepts, it's sometimes hard to pin down. They're variably defined. So one of the authors in Understanding Animal Welfare says that, in a previous publication, there is little agreement as to animal welfare's best definition. And then the authors go on to say much of the disagreement about the definition of welfare arises from the fact that different stakeholders, I should say tend to put emphasis on different aspects. Veterinarians and farmers generally focus on disease, injury, poor growth rates, and reproductive problems, right? Joanne in the group will be able to speak to that later on. Medical researchers concentrate on hygienic conditions and freedom from disease. Members of the public focus on suffering from pain, fear, or hunger, right? So here in how do we best or better define welfare, we're already inserting or reasserting the humans, the human values, who has a stake in the lives of these animals, and who gets to say what's valuable or what's not, right? Even to the point of what measures do we pay attention to when we're trying to assess the welfare state of these animals, right? So we cherry pick. We ultimately cherry pick what we care about. And so we skew our view of the animals, our understanding of the value of the animals, and we limit our understanding of them, all in pursuit of our own interests, conveniences, and so forth. So this is a Venn diagram by David Fraser, adapted from other sort of models, trying to bring together the aspects that sort of feed into the welfare state of an animal. And so he's consolidated them into natural living, basic health and functioning, and effective states. And so where they overlap, thinking about, well, what is the context, that would achieve good welfare where basic health and functioning and natural living are achieved, right? The same for effective states and basic health and functioning, or effective states and natural living, so forth. But what situation right, might we see here, right, where all of those factors are achieved, right, where there's a high level of basic health and functioning, the animals are able to express species typical behaviors, where their emotional psychological state is healthy. So this is where I'm asking to turn your microphones on, to see what you all think about, or what thoughts you have as to what context would be here. What example might we talk about here where there's a high level of, we'll use welfare in this case, a high level of welfare is achieved? What would sit right in that center of the diagram? Anyone? I knew it, Joanne. I was like, yes, Joanne's going to do it. Came through for me.
I have lots of things. I mean, I'm so glad to hear this because I've really been waiting for it since was first announced. So I guess I have a couple different thoughts. It seems to, for example, animals in the wild don't necessarily have basic health and functioning. They can breathe, they can do all this thing, but with COVID or any of these other animal diseases, and because they're often the target of other animals, their prey, those kinds of things. Can we say that animals, even if they're not being kept domesticated or in research facilities, can we say that they have basic health and functioning? Mm-hmm. Can we? That's a question for you, Liv.
Oh, well, let's when we all speak at the after, let's talk about that, because that's a really important question, Joanne. And so I'd like us to spend more time on it, because yeah.
Well, I mean, my first thought was, okay, it's an animal that's living out in the wild. And then I thought, well, maybe that's not in the confluence of these three Venn diagrams. But then I'm not sure what is.
Well, I could offer a couple ideas.
Ooh, I hear a voice.
A disembodied voice.
That's Brandon.
This is
Hello,
Brandon.
Oh, hi, Brandon. Yes, hi, great, thank you.
Hi, how are you? Two possibilities. So one, I volunteer at a farm animal sanctuary, and I help take care of the goats there. And so they are living in a herd with fairly complete autonomy. There's actually one group of the herd is not within any enclosure. They have free reign to go wherever they want during the day. They're being taken care of, living in a fairly natural way. And so it feels to me like they would be at the center of that. But also a wild animal example, the groundhog matriarch who dens behind my home. I think she's over 10 years old now. So she has certainly been very healthy in her life. And I would guess that her, her affective needs and her basic health and functioning are all well taken care of in the wild. So
do you have, can I ask Brandon, and we can come back to it in the discussion proper, but do you have, watching her, the groundhog, do you have a sense of with the behaviors that you're seeing that would speak to the affective state, her psychology? Have you?
Yes, it's. I feel like this is kind of like opening a big philosophical complexity, because I think the range of her affective states, I mean, she is certainly not a furry little human being, right? Like the sort of the standards I would use to judge whether, a human being behind my house is sort of living a fulfilled life are different than those I would apply to her. So she's not, let's say, so every spring and early summer, I watch her care for her young and interact with her mate. But those are not sort of very overtly loving relationships in the way that I'm accustomed to in
Mhm.
human relationships. But that being said, I don't think they're any the less for that. And as best as I can tell, she is, she cares for her young. She has relationships with them that are meaningful in some way. Her mate, who I think actually passed away last year, they're not a couple strolling hand in hand through the flowers, but there's a relationship there, and I don't see any evidence of distress. I feel like identifying groundhog joy is maybe more difficult to do than identifying groundhog pain or suffering or stress or fear. And I do not see evidence of the latter, including in response to predation threats, I should say too.
Okay.
If a fox comes by, she'll be very alert, she'll stand up, give the alarm whistles, do all those things, but in contrast to kind of some of, I guess, the narratives coming out of the wild animal welfare community that are really focused on fear of predation and kind of this idea that, animals are living in constant fear of being killed or eaten. It seems like she navigates that without a great deal of fear, at least visibly so. Who knows, maybe if I was studying the stress hormones in her poop, there would be signs of it, or I don't know, but.
Thanks for that's great. We'll come back to that. Yeah. Kim?
Yeah, just to be brief, in the center, perhaps I'm thinking about, I don't know if this is completely off, but right science around who they are and all of their complexities. And so then that would be specific to each animal being discussed. And then something also maybe like a duality there in the center, also a working definition of moral rights to autonomy. That might be too much for that specific Venn diagram, but the science part, really important what you were saying about cherry picking, the more palatable science. Anyway, I don't know if that's completely off.
No, it's all welcome and good. Adam?
I think my cat has a pretty good life. My doors are open all day long and my cat goes in and out, and the only issue she has is with her sister, who she doesn't like much, so they have a bit of a hissing fit every now and then, but they have pretty good lives. They're autonomous, they get fed, they enjoy themselves, I think. They could leave if they wanted, they come back, they choose to come back. And like the birds around my place and the huntsman on my roof in my bedroom, that's there for months at a time, and like the magpie family that's been there for years, the lapwings who have been there for decades, and all of these animals seem to be, I don't know, they seem pretty all right.
Stephen?
So I'm realizing as I'm thinking through what I'm about to say that it's not really an answer to your direct question. So I can definitely reserve this, but
that's okay.
I guess the two things that came into my mind were, one is this idea of taking a snapshot of an animal's life versus taking a video of an animal's life. This idea that if we're looking at a snapshot, there might be a state where an animal is experiencing joy, but if that joy isn't coupled in the video sense with fear, with wariness, with concern, then that animal won't necessarily survive for very long. So I'm thinking of a groundhog or a prairie dog. If they're not looking out for predators, then that's problematic for them and for their long-term welfare. Video sense. Then the other thought that comes to my mind is this idea of human control, because I know a lot of the contexts in which we think about animal welfare are contexts in which we as humans do have more control over an animal's longer term experience. So for example, thinking of a farmed animal sanctuary and the lives of goats, they don't have to, ideally they wouldn't have to worry about predation. So they might be able to experience joy in a longer term sense than a goat in the wild would. So again, I don't know if that's an answer, but it's just kind of a couple of thoughts that I think definitely nuance my answer of what an animal's experience of welfare looks like.
That's a great point. Fred?
Yeah, I just wanted to echo that I think that that idea of thinking of it more like a video than a snapshot. But also, I mean, it's obvious, and I'm sure we all know that animal welfare is not a binary variable. In other words, it's a continuum, right? So in the zoo world, when we were always trying to assess animal welfare of different species, a concept that I thought was useful was the phrase of free-willed. Is the animal free-willed? And you know, you might say, well, in captivity, you're never going to have a high free-willed. But for some species and some exhibits, they are. Things you look at are things like, do they have a degree of choice? Do they have control over choice of movement? And so in the wild, I think that animals are more free-willed than you might think sometimes when we get such a bias from nature shows where, they show the predators.
It's all predator and prey.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
That's
I mean,
their whole,
the reality is when you go on a safari to Africa, one of the first things you realize is, gee, it's a lot more peaceful here than I thought. I don't think animals in the wild are living such terrible lives, and that for the most part they're free-willed. And certainly it can change in a second. But anyway, free-willed is the thing that I look at for judging animal welfare.
Great. Thanks, Fred. Joanne, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah. Well, I just wonder, I think about what do we think is animal welfare? And so we're applying descriptions of what we think an animal's welfare should be. Granted that we are animals, but are we right? I mean, can we really know what animal welfare is by applying our own criteria? And I realize that doesn't really have an answer, but it just makes me think that, there are different people. I will talk about veterinary medicine maybe in the discussion, but the idea of animal welfare there is not at all what I think of it being. So I'm wondering whether we even can decide what animal welfare is, given that our experience is so very different. We don't have necessarily free will all the time. We don't necessarily.
Well, the most recent study says we don't have free will at all.
Yeah, no, I know. I think you're right. Because our society sort of forces some constraints on us. But anyway, so I don't know. It was just that was my thought that, again, depending on who you ask, it's a different definition. And how are we to know what other animals are doing, thinking, feeling? I don't know that we do.
Right. Yeah. Well, let's make a note of that, Joanne, so we can come back to it in the discussion. Bilbo and then Barbara.
I'm along very similar lines, and I think it is significant that we're all focusing in on these notions of free will and autonomy. And the phrase that stuck with me is moral rights to autonomy. And I think maybe mental and bodily autonomy. But when you reach into social and community autonomy, it becomes more problematic for me. And I do wonder if it is a reflection of a particularly American exceptionalism that suggests that individual autonomy is a right.
Barbara?
A short comment to say that I'd like to put some invertebrates in the middle of that Venn diagram.
Like my jumping spiders? Yeah, let's put some.
Well, my example would be female orb weaving spiders. For example, genus Argiope, who come August and September. And it seems to me that these big females, so much larger than the males, build their webs thoughtfully by choosing, as far as I can tell, where they want. They hunt, often quite successfully. And I don't know specifically about affective states, but we're learning with jumping spiders that there's REM sleep that may indicate dreaming. We know that in orb weavers, there's personality. So certainly we can extend that to a number of invertebrates. And it causes me to think that when a population or even a species might be at risk, individuals can still certainly have basic health and functioning. And we can say that about individuals even in the presence of risk, because otherwise no one would have basic health and functioning, including our species.
Right.
When we are constantly subject to everything from viruses to gun violence to being hit by cars. So just a bid for invertebrates.
Yeah, I'm all for it. Thank you for bringing that up. So before we move on, so I just wanted to read David's example for that interface. So this would be good welfare by all these criteria. The beagle of my childhood home, showered with affection, receiving good but not excessive food, given veterinary care when needed, free to run and hunt throughout the farm and forest, and killed instantly by a car when running across the country road. Right. And I think that gets to, like, I was thinking of like Adam's example of Adam's cats who are free to go. And we can talk about this later. I don't have that bravery maybe of just allowing my cats that reign because of my concern for their safety and the safety of others and where we live. But this idea in David's example that with all of this, that agency and autonomy and care and concern, that even in death, it came swiftly, and it came from that freedom of choice and control over one's life. So I think that example from David sort of speaks to a lot of the things that you all mentioned as well. Okay, let's move on. So this is from, and I know in the discussion, Joanne, you might have a fair bit to say about this too. So this is some information from the World Organization for Animal Health. So this was formerly known as OIE, if you speak French. Those are initials for the French words, but in 2022, I believe they officially just converted to the English name of World Organization for Animal Health. And so this organization, it's an intergovernmental organization. It formed in 1924 or 26, I think 24. And its remit was to control animal disease and the spread of animal disease, but also educate people on animal disease. And as this intergovernmental organization, it has, with this focus on disease, it has marketed itself as an animal welfare organization. So I just wanted to read a few of the statements from this organization. So we have: an animal has good welfare if they are healthy, comfortable, well-nourished, safe, able to express innate behavior, and is not suffering from unpleasant states such as pain, fear, and distress. So that was from 2010. I went to the site a few days ago to see what has changed, if anything has evolved or shifted. And their information or definitions or details on animal welfare are pretty sparse still, even though they, again, see themselves as an animal welfare organization. They define animal welfare to mean the physical and mental state of an animal in relation to the conditions in which it lives and dies. We can talk later on about the depth or lack of depth of that definition. And then they go on to say on the website, animal welfare is a complex and multifaceted subject with scientific, ethical, economic, cultural, social, religious, and political dimensions. It is attracting growing interest from civil society and is one of the priorities of the World Organization for Animal Health. So that's from December 4th, 2023. That reads like a statement from 1975. So it's interesting to see how superficial these comments are, these statements are, how anemic their conceptualization of these complex things are and remain. But I spotlight the World Organization for Animal Health because it is such a large body representing animal welfare in many nations around the world. And so its policies are quite powerful, and they have the ability to really shape the policies and regulations and research within those countries. Okay, so let me just before we move on to the next slide, I just want to go back to the language that's used here. So an animal has good welfare if they are healthy, comfortable, well-nourished, safe, able to express innate behavior, and is not suffering from unpleasant states such as pain, fear, and distress. So the language here, or there, I should say, comes pretty much from the 5 freedoms. And the 5 freedoms might be something that most, if not all of you, are familiar with. In part, and we'll talk more about this, but because the 5 freedoms really is the foundation for animal welfare science to this day, even though the 5 freedoms came about in 1965. And so so the 5 freedoms, so we have from the UK Farm Animal Welfare Council. So remember when Ruth Harrison published Animal Machines, that was in 1964. So this is all happening at the same time. And so the 5 freedoms really focuses on freedom from negative states, right? So what good welfare is freedom from thirst, hunger, and malnutrition, freedom from discomfort and exposure, freedom from pain, injury, and disease, freedom from fear and distress, and the freedom to express normal behavior. Now, one of the big questions that is often asked is any of this, even at this level, is any of this really achievable in, a farmed animal, in the farm, in a system where animals are farmed for food, with such intensity? Can you have freedom from fear and distress? Can you really express normal behavior? But we can talk more about that. So that was in the 1960s, the 5 freedoms. Then in the 1990s, right? So now we're, a few decades into animal welfare science being around and animal welfare science research accumulating. And there was a recognition that, okay, maybe the 5 freedoms is a bit thin, right? And so in the 90s, David Miller and his colleague developed a new model for animal welfare known as the 5 domains, right? So what changed here was the important inclusion of the mental state of the animals, right? That how they perceived their world was really important in terms of how they integrated all of these other factors, right? So the nutrition, environment, health, behavior. So we can try and assess those conditions largely these are all extrinsic factors, right? Nutrition, environment, health, well, aspects of health, but maybe health less so. But here we're talking about a truly intrinsic factor for the animals. What are they cognitively, psychologically, emotionally experiencing? And so this was a really important progression in how we thought about animal welfare and how we approached animal welfare science. But it was, in my estimation, it still stopped short of really recognizing who the animals are, and really stopped short of centering the animals in their own lives. Because this in and of itself, this model of the 5 domains, similar to the 5 freedoms, is not challenging the very practices, the very spaces that these animals are oftentimes forced to be in, right? Have no choice but to be in. So again, even though there's this all-important inclusion of the animal's mental state, we're still seeing a decoupling, right, of the ethics, the ethical considerations, and the science itself, right? It's saying, yeah, we have more robust science now. We're maybe not as myopic or not as anemic as, say, the 5 freedoms are, in terms of its focus just on those those particular factors, but it's still not reckoning with why are these animals confronting these conditions in the first place. So what this means is that scientific efforts, right, remain focusing on mitigating negative states and the conditions in which animals are afforded little agency, right? So even with the 5 domains, it's not challenging this, right? It's not challenging the fact that these animals are in these states, are in these conditions, and are afforded little agency. It just means maybe we have a more robust measure for how we understand their welfare state. Then in the 2010s, more the 2020s, but starting in the 2010s, we see the rise of what's known as positive welfare. And so positive welfare sought to maybe correct or redress this sort of lack of, well, let me back up. So with animal welfare as it was, animal welfare science as it had been, there was a predominant focus on mitigating negative states, right? How can we, lessen the fear that an animal is experiencing, lessen the distress, improve the expression of natural behaviors, etc. So in the 2010s, right, there has been this attempt to correct that and say, well, the lives of animals aren't just about, minimizing negative states, but what about the full extent of their lives, which includes positive emotions, right? Positive affective state. And so hence the positive qualifier to welfare. And so what positive welfare has attempted to do is focus on positive experience, right? Encourage positive experience for the animals. And so not dissimilar to the 5 freedoms and the 5 domains, but also added on to that is an attention to emotional state or mental state, like we see in the 5 domains. It encompasses the aspects of the 5 freedoms, but it also incorporates and prioritizes to varying degrees, depending upon the model of positive welfare that's implemented, choice and control, as well as environmental complexity and environmental variety for the animals. And so this has been a really positive step. Sorry, I just got a text from my husband about our cat. I just wanted to check on that. Apologize. So in general, right? Positive welfare, similar concepts. You know, they're occurring. They have emerged, right, to redress that focus that has historically been placed on the alleviation from suffering, stress, fear, those sorts of things. Again, by widening the view to include the benefits of positive experience. However, right, and so from where I stand, in my estimation, you know, while this is unquestionable progress and really important, to me, it still falls short, right? Each of these approaches, certainly the 5 freedoms, still the 5 domains and models of positive welfare, they each remain, and including positive welfare, constrained, again, to varying degrees, certainly, by the conventional practice and precedent of animal welfare, right? That was born of animal use, management, and mitigation. So even with positive welfare, it's still not fully acknowledging the entanglement of the ethics and the science, right? It's absolutely more reflective of who animals are, right? It's more similar to how we, right, assess our own state of well-being or welfare, which includes positive challenges, it includes reasonable compromises, it includes positive experience, right? But for us, for our species, that would correlate or associate with the conditions we find ourselves in, right? Or either we put ourselves in or being asked to put in. But for animal welfare science, even positive animal welfare science, that those challenges aren't happening, right? It's still about the assessment. How do we assess the welfare state more robustly? And to be fair, and, you know, provide a better life for those animals in our care, right? But it's not really challenging why we have to do that. What led to these conditions for those animals? Why are we having to redress this? Why are we having to find ways to overcome it? That's not being really reckoned with, even in positive welfare. So animal welfare science, in my estimation, remains anthropocentric, right? It is absolutely, unquestionably driven by human values, human interests, human conveniences. And that's what perpetuates the practices that persist to this day, right? That we're still having to find ways to correct, recorrect, adjust, readjust, because we haven't sufficiently, if at all, again, really grappled with why animals are in these situations to begin with. And animal welfare science hasn't really reckoned with the fact that it is an anthropocentric field. So in this diagram, this is to show sort of a stepwise progression. So I have here non-agentic living. So you can think of this as a life not worth living, right? Where an animal is not able to fully manifest its own agency, right? Its level of autonomy is almost absent, right? The conditions in which they're living are one of complete deprivation. We can use our, if not our own personal embodied knowledge, we can certainly use our collective embodied knowledge to understand what that might mean for a human in conditions like that. And certainly that's going on. We know it's gone on throughout time, and we're certainly seeing a lot of that in the world today, where humans are being forced to live in absolute deplorable conditions with no control over their own lives. Then we have what I call sort of a state of avoiding, right? We're out of that state of total deprivation, but conditions are such that the animal might be able to sort of strive, right? Like work towards avoiding those conditions that are undesirable, unwanted, detrimental, and maybe strive or work towards something more positive with maintaining. And I use the gerund here, the ing, to show how this is dynamic, right? These aren't static states. They're dynamic, within, right? They're dynamic in multi directions. And so we don't want to assume just because there's a welfare state that an animal is experiencing in one context, it doesn't necessarily need to continue that way, for whether it's positive or negative. Maintaining is better, right? Where we're sort of in this sort of status quo of conditions. Obtaining means there's, again, something more to strive for. There are other resources, other motivations in the environment that allow the animal to sort of push through. And then we have agentic living, right? So another way to think of this is a life worth living, right? Fully flourishing, thriving. And so here's where I think the welfarist approach falls, right? It's really sitting, maybe not fully, squarely over non-agentic living, but certainly it probably straddles it. It certainly includes avoiding, maintaining, and obtaining, and probably sits here, right? The welfarist approach of animal welfare science is not pushing towards agentic living, an agentic life. It's not pushing towards a life worth living, because animal welfare science, for example, isn't challenging animals as food, right, that are produced through really intense practices. What animal welfare science is doing is, okay, well, how do we assess the welfare state of, for example, a pig in those conditions? How do we improve the welfare state of a sow in those conditions? But it's going to be a fairly modest improvement, right? Because of the conditions themselves, right? You're being forced to reproduce, right? You have no control, no agency, no autonomy over when you reproduce, with whom you reproduce, where you reproduce. In many cases, those sows have no opportunity to even provide for their offspring, for their piglets. And so for the most part, right, animal welfare science is hovering over here, right? If it were really to be focused here, it would be something altogether different, right? And that's where well-being comes in, right? So well-being, animal well-being, is not about a life not worth living, about conditions to avoid, about status quo, about striving under adverse circumstances. It's about how do we, as humans, in relation with other animals, help to provide and support a life worth living for those animals. So now I want to move a little bit more into animal well-being. So I'm just going to read some words from me at this point. So the scientific position of animal welfare has been, on one hand, to acknowledge of animals their physiological and biological needs alongside their cognitive capacities. And I'll get to this. So through animal welfare science alone, right, as an interdisciplinary field, which it is, we have enough knowledge about animals, right? So we know, right, animal welfare science is acknowledging physiological, biological needs, cognitive capacities, the rich mental states. That's coming out of animal welfare science. However, the other hand is that animal welfare science also denies bearing of this acknowledgement to animals and situations where the science isn't in yet, or where it's inconvenient, where it provides tension with our values, with our interests, etc. Right? So when it butts up against those, right, then we forget, right? We put aside the richness of their lives, the knowledge we have about the complexity of their lives, who they are, and so forth. So instead, right, we should be advancing beyond this welfareist approach that's come to focus almost exclusively on mitigating conditions in which animals are afforded little agency. And we should be practicing a science of animal well-being that sees animal health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of, for example, disease or infirmity. So with animal well-being, it decenters the human, right? And it's not to say, not to center the animal in place of humans necessarily, but it does center the animal as agents in their own lives with their own interests, right? With whom we live among, right? That's represented in this wonderful illustration by an artist friend of mine, right? That here we are, right, in our human homes, living with and among other animals, and they have just as much right to be there, to exist, and to see ourselves in relation with those animals, and not at the center of their lives. And that's a really important distinction. So while I talk about a science of animal well-being, and I'll talk more about this, yes, it means, okay, well, how do we assess then well-being? What methods do we use? What do we focus on? What are important variables or parameters? But even more important than that is a well-being approach very deliberately does not decouple the ethics and the science. The science, the research, the approach itself is driven very directly by the ethical concern, and the ethical lens through which we see the animals that we live alongside. And that's a really important difference, right? So if you go back to the quotations that I read earlier, right? Animal welfare is this, but animal welfare science is this, right? That separation. And, you might hear scientists say, well, that's just because scientists need to be objective, right? That just means we don't want bias in our research. Well, you can still develop methodologies that are scientifically sound, but not ethically unsound, right? And that's what's happening in animal welfare science, is that through this residue of positivism or behaviorism, right? This sort of disingenuous bowing towards objectivism, we're denying how the ethics and the values actually shape the very research that we do, right? So the animal welfare science are just privileging other biases, right? That deny animals much of their lives and much of their complexities, whereas an animal well-being approach is very openly acknowledging that connection and saying to do better science means we have to put the ethics at the fore, that needs to be the foundation to our scientific approach, not separate from it, that we are going to be better scientists, we're going to have better knowledge if we shape our research questions, our methodologies from the very ethics. The other thing is the lenses that we use to see the world and make sense of the world, right? Shape our perspectives, right? And those lenses that we use can distort, right? Or they can clarify, or they can crystallize how we see the world. And in my estimation, animal welfare science, as it's developed, distorts the natural world. It prevents us from seeing truth in the natural world. And instead, we see what we want to see. And so here, I think, is a welfarist approach, right? Where we might, let's just do a physiological, look at some physiological measures. Or here we're going to look at some maybe body condition. Or maybe we'll consider affective states here and there. But it's not very comprehensive, it's not systematic, and will largely be driven by the interests of those conducting the actual research and shaping the questions we ask. So the view we get of the animals from a welfarist approach is quite distorted, incomplete, right? It's myopic. I think with a well-being approach that, again, centers the animals in their lives, and therefore centers the animals in our relation with them, right? I think is what would lead to a much more crystallized view of them and of the natural world. So as a someone who, well, as an ethologist, I'm always hesitant to define myself by certain terms, but as an ethologist, right, someone who studies animal behavior, but also someone who is studies the science of animal well-being, another lens that is distorting is this one. And so I'm not sure how many people are familiar with this. So this is, I know I'm going over long, Bill, but we sort of included a little bit of some questions. So this is Nico Tinbergen. So he's what would we say? He's a great grandfather, great, who's good with generations of ethology. So one of the Nobel Prize winners who documented social lives of animals, and these levels of analysis or forward questions still shape how ethology is studied today, right? This is in every animal behavior course, any animal behavior textbook. So these are, they're often referred to as Tinbergen's 4 questions or Tinbergen's levels of analysis. And I won't belabor them, but I just want to go over them really quickly. So they're broken up into proximate and ultimate, focusing on more mechanistic sort of an approach, and a more distant approach focusing on survival and evolutionary history, right? So how do we study behavior? How do we approach the study of animal behavior? Well, we could study it mechanistically. We could look at, how do hormone concentrations vary and how do they affect behavioral expression? Or how does sexual maturity affect behavioral expression? And so forth, or just juvenile versus an adult. How do behaviors differ between those developmental stages? Or we could think about the ontogeny approach, which is how does animals' expression of the behavior change over the animal's lifetime? For example, is it learned? Does it develop over time? What is its relationship to I'll get there. So, and then we can think of phylogeny. So thinking about, how did this behavior evolve in this species? Did it differ from related species, and so forth, right? So these are, again, lenses through which we can approach our study of animal behavior. And oftentimes, animal behaviorists kind of ascribe to a certain lens. Some are, I'm a mechanistic animal behaviorist, or I study evolutionary history of behavior, etc. Now, this isn't to say that animal behaviors don't understand that these are totally entangled. These are just the lenses through which we might study behavior. But what it does do is lead to a reduction in the way that we understand animals, right? We compartmentalize them. And so sometimes it might be, we compartmentalize them, and here's a piece of the puzzle that we put out in the world, but who is responsible for reassembling those pieces so that we have a complete picture of those animals, of those species, and so forth? So that's been a real sort of challenge in my teaching of animal behavior and trying to help students overcome the limitations of Tinbergen's questions. And again, Tinbergen's questions aren't going away anytime soon, right? They are still seen as, the sort of how you study behavior. So this is my addition to the 4 questions to help us elevate ethology. And this feeds into animal well-being as well. So placing animal well-being through this ethological lens. And so my addition is what I call epistemic ontology, right? So this is seeing the animal holistically and putting a responsibility on the researcher to see an animal holistically. And also seeing and recognizing, acknowledging that an animal, right, is an agent in their own life with an interior experience, with an inner world that interacts with their environment, right? Their abiotic and biotic environment. So as I define epistemic ontology as what does an animal perceive, feel, and know regarding their own behavioral expressions, right? So this infuses ethology with well-being, animal well-being, right? And this coalesces our knowledge and our understanding rather than what we see in these other approaches is it's a distillation, right? And sometimes a useful one, but as it's played out in ethology and animal behavior, it's led to a reductive approach to understanding who animals are. So how can we sort of recover that? So this leads me to my spheres of well-being. So how do we study the well-being of animals? How do we take this well-being approach in, quote unquote, in the field? And as we kind of go around and talk about these spheres, you'll see that it's not like I'm telling you something that doesn't exist somewhere else, right? So much of this comes from animal welfare science, comes from cognitive science, comes from evolutionary science, etc. It's not like I'm necessarily reinventing the wheel in and of itself, but it's how we take these things together to approach our relationship with other animals. So the things that I think are really important to consider when we're considering animal well-being and studying animals is culture, eco-social environment of the animals, their environmental engagement, their behavioral repertoire, the expression of what I call privileged behaviors. So an example of a privileged behavior would be play, right? So play is something that comes about when risk is low, when stress is low, and it's one of those behaviors that goes away almost immediately when there's perceived stress, when there's perceived risk. It doesn't mean play is not really important. It just means that it's really at the whim of environmental conditions. Physical health, right? 5 freedoms. Physical health absolutely matters, right? Shelter, safety, nutrition, they matter, but also reasonable challenges and reasonable compromises matter in the lives of these animals. Knowledge, opportunities through learning and exploration. Emotional balance, including positive affect, the ability of self-expression. What is the lived experience of those individuals? If we have the opportunity to know that, oftentimes we don't, but if we can understand the lived experience of those animals, it's really important. And the other thing is that this is all situated within an understanding of the evolutionary legacy of these animals. Who are they? Where have they come from? Who are they related to? Not just in the short term, but the long term. And so I've been trying to implement this approach to animal well-being in my work in the field with the Asian elephants in our project with rewilding. And my approach to rewilding is seeing it as a psychosocial, ecological phenomenon, which in and of itself is quite radical and has ruffled a lot of feathers. And so in this approach, I situate the individual within the group membership, within the social context, and within the greater ecology. So this nest is true not just for free living animals, but is totally applicable and relevant to animals, right? Our companion animals, animals in any space. And then through this, right, seeing how autonomy and agency map onto it, and what opportunities for autonomy and agentic expression there are, and through that, to see what well-being is made manifest. And in my estimation, manifest well-being is only possible through this approach. And that's it. I finally finished. Thanks, everyone.
Pan Thinks is a production of PanWorks, an ethics, science, and policy think tank for the well-being of animals. It is edited and produced by Gary Shear with the help of Bill Lynn. To learn more about PanWorks, visit our website at panworks.io. To donate to our work, please visit our support page on our website. Until next time, this is PanWorks, bringing ethics to life.